Video game graphics have changed super fast the last few decades, and new games are introducing new techniques all the time. I'm Falcon, and today on GameRanks, we have 10 landmark games that changed video game graphics forever. Number 10, Crusaders of Might and Magic got kinda mediocre reviews. Wasn't good, wasn't bad, sometimes felt a little rushed, sometimes felt a little like it didn't get any attention. That's a long time ago. It did have one thing that other games did not have at the time, and that is dynamic shadows. Being the game wasn't incredible, it wasn't the game that popularized the technique, but when your character was around light sources, it actually affected what the shadow looked like. And I know that in your head when I say that, that sounds ridiculous. I'm calling that impressive. At the time, nothing like that existed. Shadows were generally just like a blurry, transparent black circle underneath your character, which obviously does work for certain art styles, but not supposedly realistic ones. Number 9, where Crusaders of Might and Magic had one thing, Far Cry had quite a few. Really what set Far Cry apart was how it handled some aspects of weather, for instance wind. It may not seem like that's a really intense graphical technique, but in order for vegetation to work properly with wind, everything has to act as an animated object. Everything has to have physics, it has to react realistically to the wind, and in the case of Far Cry, they went so far they made it possible for the wind to break vegetation. And that animation wasn't predefined. It wasn't break vegetation 1, break vegetation 2. No, it was actually procedurally generated breakage of various plants, and those plants could also regenerate over time. Another thing Far Cry was able to do is procedurally generate fire, and because the fire was a volumetric thing, an actual system as opposed to just an animation, the wind could ripple in and spread it all over the place. A lot of people just take weather for granted, but you have to remember literally nothing happens in a game unless people program it. So it's really impressive they were able to do this and have it turn out that good for being one of the first, if not the first, to the table on that. Number 8 is Messiah, which used a technique called tessellation to essentially quote-unquote future-proof its 3D models. Way back in the day they had polygon budgets. You had to give a certain amount of polygons to all objects in a game in order to keep the game running on the current hardware. Tessellation would dynamically figure out how many polygons needed to be used and calculate down to that. In other words, you could put in a very, very high resolution, high polygon model, and the computer would figure out how to make it work on a basic computer system at the time. Obviously, this is becoming less and less necessary, but at the time, it was a pretty innovative technique that allowed artists to just be a little bit more artistic and not waste all their time making 5 different versions of a 3D model that would work on various levels of computer. Number 7, Red Faction, which you could destroy environments using what was labeled geomod technology. Previously in games, in order for an environment to be destructible, it basically had to have pre-rendered, pre-scripted points that you could destroy. Not so in Red Faction. You could not only dig or blow up the ground, buildings were actually physical structures made out of varying materials that you could legitimately break. The actual physical ground was sort of scaled back in Red Faction Guerrilla, but the buildings themselves were scaled way up. It became much, much more detailed how you could destroy a building in that game. It was very neat. But it weren't for Red Faction and Red Faction Guerrilla essentially showing us how fun and cool it looks to destroy a building in a video game world, people like myself wouldn't be wondering where the hell Crackdown 3 is. Number 6, Descent, which was not the first 3D game. No, but instead of populating the world with sprites, Descent populated it with 3D models made of polygons. Right there, I could just say, yeah, checkmate. First game that did that. If you're not impressed by that, I don't know what you would be impressed by. Being the first polygon-oriented 3D game. And yes, to be clear, the worlds of Doom are actually not polygons. They're instead height maps. We've explained it before. It's pretty arcane, but pretty cool too. Still, Descent brought everything into a different place. On top of that, you had 6 degrees of freedom. You were able to point in any direction and go in any direction. It was a really amazing technical achievement at the time, and I also thought it was a really fun game. Number 5, Hitman, which was one of the first games to use the ragdoll system for physics on all of the characters, as well as verlet integration. Verlet integration stores velocity data for various points and generally does a good job simulating momentum. It's a key part of simulating cloth. And as we all know, the ragdoll system is basically something that, well, it creates some very funny animations unintentionally. But at the same time, it creates context-sensitive animations that wouldn't really be possible without having used it. And since techniques have been used to make it so that these animations turn out to be a lot less funny, which is both good and bad, good for realism, bad for goofy people, I guess. Basically, stuff that happens in Hitman can be pretty funny because it is both at the same time more realistic and less realistic because of its physics systems. But it was first on a lot of those physics systems, and they're all used today. Number 4, performance capture in Beyond Two Souls. Although the game itself was not what you would call a huge hit or amazing, they built on an idea that was first used in LA Noire that sometimes made really great looking animation in that game and sometimes made the most horrifically strange animation. However, in Beyond Two Souls, it was finally done in a capacity that seemed, well, consistently good. Also with LA Noire, they only did it with faces, whereas Beyond Two Souls did it with entire people. The face was obviously the most detailed capture point, but they would move around on a green set with tons of motion capture on it. But these incredibly high detailed versions of performance capture ended up not quite being exactly what's done. Like, varying levels of performance capture has been used for a long time, but nothing on this level. And to be frank, I don't think you'll see a whole lot of it, because it's not, well, let's say efficient. Meaning it's very expensive, and although it's cool, it really doesn't enhance the game a lot, but it's still a massive technical achievement. Number 3, Star Wars Dark Forces, which you're gonna be shocked by why we're saying this, but this was the first-person shooter that you could look up and down in. There's not really a whole lot to say about that. In Wolfenstein, you can't look up and down. In Doom, you can't look up and down. In pretty much every one of those games, you can't look up and down. And it's inherent in the way that the games are built. Even Star Wars Dark Forces isn't a true 3D game. All of the 3D games of that time were built on tricks, essentially, to achieve 3D. These abilities needed to be added, though, on account there were environmental puzzles that, well, were made a lot easier by actually having freedom to look where you wanted to look. It was kind of a shame the game was a bit short, though, because the gameplay, I remember it being really good. Although compared to today's advanced first-person shooters, probably not so much, but looking at things through the old rose-colored glasses is a lot of fun. Number 2 is Quake 3 Arena, which managed to use curved surface geometry. Before this, every single surface had a very math-looking, right-angle-y, stark, harsh surface, whereas smooth things started to emerge, which doesn't just, happen in real life, but also curved surfaces do a very good job at hiding a lack of detail, meaning stuff could look better without actually being better. And finally, number 1, Doom, which was 3D. Yeah, Wolfenstein 3D was kind of 3D, but only rendered walls. Doom rendered full environments. So we're giving it the first thing there. It's not just a crappy simulation of what it would be like to be in a 3D space. It actually feels like you're in a 3D space. Even though it's not true 3D, they had finally at least managed to make it look like true 3D. Even going back to Doom now seems like a 3D game. Even though all the levels were built on extrusion maps, which made it impossible to put one room on top of another room. It was still very innovative. And I'm just gonna say it, if there wasn't a first 3D game, there wouldn't be a million 3D games. Can you imagine what it would be like if there weren't 3D games? I mean, nothing against 2D games, some of my favorite games are 2D games, but I can't even imagine a world without 3D games at this point. What was a game that just blew you away with graphics at the time? It doesn't have to still hold up now, but let's talk about that in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please click like, and if you're not subscribed, now would be a great time to do just that. We upload brand new videos every day of the week, and we thank you very much for watching this one. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter at Falcon.